is a private video shot through somebody's personal, very expensive telescope. And we're going to try to totally amaze you. We're not going to tell you exactly the date this was filmed, but I can tell you it's in the northern hemisphere, and the focus of this telescope was to bright spots that were just cresting the limb. And you can see already, right in the middle of this large crater, that doesn't look like anything that should be on the moon. Doesn't even look like it belongs there. But the shadows are consistent between the two craters, as well as the really high reflective edge of the crater. And so it looks like the sun is off to the right, slightly towards the top of the screen. But mostly the sun is just off to the right of your viewing angle. And I want you to pay attention to these craters, and I want you to pay attention to the reflective boundaries, because we're going to get into some even more suspicious shapes, and we're going to see shadows that do not conform to the shadows you see here. Now, the shadows are moderately long. This crater rim is not exactly towering. It does leave a significant shadow that covers at least a third of the crater. So the sun is sitting somewhat low with respect to the surface of the moon. But again, we start to see a repetitive theme with looks like spherical buildings with connecting type tubes or structural components in between. And yes, these can be natural. It could just be artifact of light and reflection, but when you look close, you're going to see that some of these are elevated structures. They're arches. Now, arches can happen again. They can happen naturally, but nobody to this day has ever reported seeing an arch on the moon. But some of these arches, if you look, some of these structures are elevated. You can see the shadow. You can see through the structure itself, and you can see that they are elevated. Look at the shadow on the right, that big triangle shadow. When you review this film, you'll see there doesn't seem to be anything that could be causing that shadow. That's a very significant shadow. And here we are again. We see what looks like shadows, but wait a minute, something's different. Okay, there's no gray areas. There's like a bluish, navy blue hint to this dark shadow. It seems to be really well defined on all the images, but yet there's not a structure that can account for the shape of this shadow. You don't see any tall mountains there, do you? And directly over and on the boundaries of these different looking shadows, you'll see even more suspicious structural components that look artificial. Compare the crater again up top. That shadow has a transition gray area. It doesn't have some well-defined edges, but yet all the shadows in the foreground closer to you are very well-defined. Very, very large shadows, very well-defined shapes, and yet you cannot find any mountains to account for these shadows that you see. And indeed, looking down, it looks like you're looking at a lake. It looks like you're looking at a dam. It looks like you're looking at hydroelectric. Some smaller parts look like a sewage treatment plant. Some parts even look like a nuclear power plant with spherical domed structures. So I'm going to run this video through again. And it addresses the origins of life in the solar system. Has life been seeded throughout? Are there life forms that breathe anything else other than oxygen? Well, on Earth there is. Half of all microorganisms don't breathe oxygen. Almost every single plant on the planet doesn't breathe oxygen. There is a ton of life that doesn't breathe oxygen. So the atmospheres of other planets and what's there is kind of a moot point when discussing the possibility of life throughout the solar system. Now, we've tried to show some structures on the moon. There's some really interesting moon anomaly videos out there. Some really interesting stuff to kind of pass away a couple hours. But the bottom line is when you see shadows, they have to conform to the topography that's creating the shadows. So where there's a peak, you should see a longer peak if the sun's a little low. Okay, we give you all that. However, the shadows in these craters that you see before you do not match the patterns associated with the shadows of the suspicious looking lake structures. So take a look at this, post your comments. We just say this is all suspicious, and we say it's very interesting. We are not making any firm claims as to what is on the moon, but I'm venturing a guess. There's a hell of a lot more out there than anybody's ever led us on to knowing about. So we're going to run this through again and again. Look at the shadows. They're just not matching up. Some of those structures are raised. You can see underneath them. And look at these darker shadows that have more of a bluish hint to them, a navy blue hint. I don't know what it is, but it's really something to really scrutinize. How in the heck do you get these huge shadows when there's no huge mountains nearby? And the components look lake-like. I mean, very lake-like. And from these quote-unquote things that look like lakes, we see canals. We see beaches. And we see drier, softer, like sand beds. Like they could be overflows that are now dry. Now, I know this all sounds crazy. But then again, so does little green men coming out of the mouth of the highest military mind in the United States. So it is very obvious that there's a lot of artificiality and towers and networking of very artificial looking stuff right here on this video of the moon. And if you did not know this was the moon, you would think it was on Earth. This is a private video shot through somebody's personal, very expensive telescope. And we're going to try to totally amaze you. We're not going to tell you exactly the date this was filmed, but I can tell you it's in the northern hemisphere, and the focus of this telescope was to bright spots that were just cresting the limb. And you can see already, right in the middle of this large crater, that doesn't look like anything that should be on the moon. Doesn't even look like it belongs there. But the shadows are consistent between the two craters, as well as the really high reflective edge of the crater. And so it looks like the sun is off to the right.